the azure blue, a God concealed from human sight. He tipped its skies with heavenly hue, and framed the worlds with his great might. There is a God.
We have been studying 1st and 2nd Samuel for some time now. And I don't know about you, but Vic has made each lesson very interesting and very informative. And I have truly enjoyed, even though they're old stories, there are new lessons in those old stories. And the thing that has amazed me through our study is that how many of the people and the events that we have studied about in 1st and 2nd Samuel are repeated in our lifetime. You can almost look at some of them and say, well, you know, that sounds like so-and-so. So truly, the old statement that history repeats itself, we can see that all around us as you study 1st and 2nd Samuel and the people and the events that are recorded there. And that shouldn't be any surprise to anybody because Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 11, now all these things happened unto them for examples. They are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. So Paul says that it's not by coincidence that these things are recorded that we're studying in 1st and 2nd Samuel, but they are written for our example and for our admonition. So we need to learn from those examples that are included in 1st and 2nd Samuel and the other books of the Old Testament. It is because of that that I want to go back in our study and pick up an example. And I realize that as we go through these with Victor and others, you can't include everything, and so you have to pass over something. So I want to go back to one example that I think is worthy of our remembering today. And I want to go back to 2 Samuel chapter 9. So I'm back about, 5 chapters. But anyway, you'll recognize it when we get there. That example, of course, as are most of them in 1st and 2nd Samuel, is from the life of King David. Now, David was a most unusual man. In fact, some have said that his name is recorded in the Old and New Testament about 1,000 times. I don't know if that's true or not, but he's recorded, his name's mentioned over and over again in the Old Testament as well as in the New. And you cannot consider the kings of Israel without noting the reign of David. It was an unusual reign. David was a man of war. We saw that in his leading the armies under Saul. He was a man of war. He was strong in battle. He was courageous in the life that he lived. But this prevented him from building the temple to God. Even though David had gathered all the materials to build it, God did not allow him to build the temple because he was a man of war. In fact, in 2 Chronicles 22 and verse 8, but the word of the Lord came to me, saying, thou hast shed blood abundantly, and hast made great wars. Thou shalt not build a house unto my name, because thou hast shed much blood upon the earth and in my sight. And so even though David wanted to do that and had attempted to get everything ready for that construction. He was not allowed to do that because he was a man of war. But there's another characteristic that I want us to think about this morning about King David. And even though he was courageous and he was bold and he was a warrior and a man of distinction, David was a man of kindness. And you cannot read his life without coming to that conclusion that he was. Although he was a human being just like you and me, and even though he made some terrible, terrible mistakes, the Bible says he was a man after God's own heart. Now, I don't know about you, but I've thought about many times. How could a man who had done such evil things, adultery, fornication, murder, how could he be a man after God's own heart? And the Bible very plainly says that he was indeed a man after God's own heart. In fact, in 1 Samuel 13, verse 14, it says, "But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart." Saul had sinned, you remember, and God has said, your kingdom is going to be taken away from you. And he said, I have found a man after God's own heart. That was David. And so God says that he was a man after his own heart. It's interesting that as you go to the New Testament, that name and that characteristic is again confirmed by the Apostle Paul when he was in Antioch. And he's preached there, and he said in Acts 13, verse 22, "And when he had removed him," talking about Saul, "he raised up unto them David to be their king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, I have found David the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart." So God said he's a man after mine own heart. And God said it, you got to believe it, that he certainly was a man after his own heart. Well, as you think about that and all the things that David had done that were bad, how could he possibly have been a man after God's own heart? And the answer is he was a kind individual. Over and over again in the life of David, there were acts of kindness that he did. I'm sure you remember many of them. There were many acts of kindness to King Saul, who was a bitter enemy, who tried to kill David. But there was kindness over and over again to King Saul. The one that stands out in my mind was the time in the cave when David and King were in the same area. And King Saul was asleep. And David's servant said, now you got him, put him away right now. And David said, no, I will not do that. Later on in battle, when Saul was injured, David again said, what have you done to God's anointed? Kindness to Saul by David was over and over again. The last time Victor was here, we talked about another act of kindness. It was the woman of Tekoa. And you remember, of course, she came trying to trick David into admitting that he should let Absalom come back. But again, she said, I'm a poor widow. My two sons, one of them's dead. Now they want to kill the other one. And immediately, David says, no, we're not going to allow them to do that, and they're not going to harm you. What an act of kindness it was to that poor widow by King David. So that was another example. Again, Nahum, who was king of the Ammonites, while David was fleeing from Saul, David went down to his home or his palace and was hidden there for a while from Saul. Well, as time progressed, the king, Nahum, passed away, and his son took over the kingship. And David sent a message to him of consolation and condolences to him. Why would he do that? Out of kindness in his heart for what his father had done for him. And then we come to the character that I want us to talk about today in our lesson. And that is the man Jonathan. Jonathan and David had a very special relationship. They obviously were about the same age, but they had a very strong friendship. And on one occasion, as they were together, Jonathan said to David, "David, you're going to be the king, but I want you to promise me that you will be kind to me all the days that I live, and that when I am gone, you will be kind to my family forever." And David, of course, as a good friend, made that promise. That will come to pass, Jonathan. Well, Saul, of course, dies in the battle with the Philistines. And Jonathan dies in the battle, and all of the servants of Saul. And as David gets word that this battle has gone bad and that Saul has been killed and Jonathan, his friend, is dead, he asks an interesting question. Is there any family members of Saul that are still alive? He was still concerned out of kindness about his friend Jonathan. Now, I don't know, but commentators say that it was at least 10 or 12 years after Saul had died that recollection of the promise that David had made to Jonathan comes up. I don't know, maybe it was the fact that moving into the kingdom and becoming king and taking over and appointing all of his appointees and all of those kinds of things, that time passed. But it was a long time. But eventually that promise that David had made to Jonathan returned. And as he began to think about it and to look for survivors, he asked, are there any family members that survived all of this? And he was told, yes, there's a servant of Saul by the name of Ziba. And if anybody knows, Ziba would know. And so David, of course, calls for Ziba and said, are there any remaining relatives of Jonathan that still exist? And Ziba says, yes, there's one. There's a young man who was 5 years old when Saul died. And as his nurse sought to escape the battle, she dropped him at 5 years old. And he's lame even to this day. David said, well, who is he? Where is he? And he said, his name is Mephibosheth. And he lives in a certain place. And so David immediately says, send servants and says, find him and fetch him and bring him to me. Well, you might think that was kind, but I'm not sure Mephibosheth thought that. Because being the only survivor, he thought, well, he's coming to get me now. But that was not the purpose at all. And he shows up before King David. And then in 2 Samuel 9 and verse 7, David says to Mephibosheth, fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness for thy father's sake. Now that's the key command. I'll show you kindness for your father's sake. You know, as you stop and think about it, Jonathan was only 5 years old when Saul died. 5 years old, there was not a lot he could do for David. But David says, for your father's sake, I want to show kindness to you. And what a wealth of kindness it was. He said to Mephibosheth, you're to live here in the palace. You're to sit at my table and eat at my table. And you are to be as a son to me. And not only that, all of Saul's inheritance that his relatives would have inherited, I'm going to give to you. And you shall prosper as a result of it. What a blessing it was to Mephibosheth. He really hadn't done anything to earn it. He was only 5 years old when all of this happened. And yet look at the benefits that came to Mephibosheth because of his father's sake. And that is really the bottom line of my lesson to you today. Mephibosheth was treated royally all the days of his life, not because something that he had done, but rather because his father Jonathan was a wonderful man, a good man, a strong man, and David wanted to do something for his children, for his father's sake. Now again, we come back to what I said in the very beginning. There are many, many lessons that we see in these events, but we also can put ourselves in many of those same situations. And I wonder how many doors have been opened in our lifetime, have been opened for good to some young man because of his father's sake. I'm sure it's happened over and over and over again. It may have happened in your life. But nevertheless, it happens time and time again. And I guess a good name is about the best inheritance we can leave our children. If we leave them a good name, they're going to have doors open to them all the days of their lives. In fact, have you ever heard the statement, he or she came from a good family? That's that good name that was passed on from one to another. In Psalms 22 and verse 3, the psalmist says, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. A good name is a great inheritance. Jonathan gave his son Mephibosheth a great heritage, a good name, and because of that good name, and because of that good life of the father, the son dwells in a palace and eats at the table of the king. And if we as parents can leave our children a good name, they will be blessed in so many different ways. That's a great challenge to parents today. But we can do that. Jonathan did, as an example for us. And so we must strive in our lives today to leave our children a good name. But there was a second aspect of David's life that I want to mention. And that is that when he exerted kindness to someone, he always said, it is the kindness of God that I want to bestow. When they asked him about if there was any relatives, or he asked his servants if there was any relatives, and he said to them, that I might show the kindness of God. David realized that kindness was something that he needed to do. But it was not from him, it was from God in heaven that kindness was to be exerted. But the second aspect of David's life with a heart of God was that David did not allow his father's evil toward David influence him. Over and over again, there was the disturbance between Jonathan and Saul over David. But Jonathan did not allow the evil that his father was perpetrating on David to influence him. In fact, all throughout that association, Jonathan was loyal to David, even above his own father. And again, that was the time when David and Jonathan were together that he said, you're going to be the king. I'm in line for it, but you're going to be the king. But you be kind to me all the days that I live, and be kind to my family forever. And so that's what prompted the promise that was made. But the fact of the matter that Saul was seeking to kill David as a bitter enemy, Jonathan did not allow that to influence his relationship with David. Some of us have known of instances where parents did not leave a good name. In fact, they left a terrible example to their children. We must learn from Jonathan, that we cannot allow that evil influence to influence our lives to the point that we can be lost as a result of. In fact, that is one of the reasons that we're told in Ezekiel 18 and verse 20, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. The idea that, my dad was such a rogue kind of guy, or my mother was so bad, I guess that's why I am. No. Emily and I talk all the time about who got the good genes with our kids. Was it from her side or from my side? You know who she thinks they came from. But, we talk about that sometimes, our parents had this kind of an influence on us. And if the parents' influence was not a good one, then we have a larger job to do. As you think about that, when we have evil parents, generally the children respond in one of two ways. First of all, they can say, I'm not going to live like that. I see what that did to our family. I see that what that did to my mother. I see what that did to my father. And I'm not going to live like that. But I'm going to live as God would have me live. That's what we hope that would be the response. Sometimes that evil influence is so great that it overcomes that desire to do what God would have us to do, and I'm not going to live like that individual. And then sometimes there is the idea that I'm going to not let that affect me or my family, but I'm going to live as God would have me to live. One of two ways. Certainly David said, "For thy father's sake." And as a result of the influence of Jonathan's, Mephibosheth's father on David, he was blessed abundantly. You know, it's not very hard to picture a situation even in our lifetime where here's a young man who comes into a strange town on his own, and he finds out there's a friend of his father who's the executive of a big corporation. And so that son goes to the building where the corporation is, and he goes up to the top floor where this individual is. And he walks into the office and says to the secretary, you know, "I'm so-and-so, and I'd like to speak to Mr. So-and-so." And the secretary would normally say, "Well, do you have an appointment?" "No, I don't have an appointment." "Well, you know, he's very busy today. We can give you an appointment." And the young man says, well, when could I see him? He said, "Well, it'd be 2 or 3 weeks." And the young man says, "Well, would you tell him that so-and-so is here and I'm his son?" Well, she goes into the executive and she said, "There's a young man out here. He doesn't have an appointment, but he wants to see you. And he says he's the son of a friend of yours." And he said, "Well, who is he?" And she tells him. And guess what he says? "Bring him in. Let me talk to him." And he says to the secretary, "We were good friends back in college. Bring him in and let me see him." And the young man comes in unannounced without an appointment. And as they talk and they recollect memories and so on, the executive says, "What can I do for you?" "Well, I'm just in town. I don't know. I don't have a job and I don't have a place to stay," and so on. And that executive says, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." That could have happened yesterday in Jacksonville, but it happened in Mephibosheth's life many, many years ago. As parents, we must be very careful with the influence that we leave with our children. There are some influences that children have a hard time living down. I think about the man who assassinated President Kennedy. His progeny probably changed their name. How would you like to say that? I'm a relative of the man who assassinated the president. What a reputation. What an influence to live down. And yet that happens over and over again. So there are one of two ways that we can deal with evil influence of parents. And one is to say that I will not live like that, or to excuse it and say, well, you know, that's the way Mom and Daddy live, so I'm going to live. I guess I'll live just like that. For thy father's sake, David said, I will show him not my kindness, but God's kindness. And we have that example for us and that example to follow. There's one other example that I want to mention. And this is an example found in the New Testament. But it's the same principle that we've been talking about this morning. And that's the example found in 2 Timothy 1 and verse 5. This is the example of Paul and Timothy. And in that chapter we read, when I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in thee, which dwelleth first in thy grandmother Lois and thy mother Eunice, and I am persuaded that in thee also. That sort of enlarges the sphere of influence. He said, Timothy, as I recall the faith, the unfeigned faith that is in your grandmother and in your mother and in you. 3 generations of good influence on the life of a very valuable asset in the Lord's work. I realize that many of us here are not only parents, but we're grandparents. But the task still is ours. Even as grandparents, we still have the obligation to leave a good reputation for our children, a good influence, a good example for them. And certainly as they look back, they can recall those good things that hopefully will influence, as did the grandparents in the life of Timothy. But also not only the good things of the grandparents, but also of your mother. And you know, we think about fathers being the head of the house, and certainly that's true, and they have a great input into the actions and so on of that house. But the mother also has a tremendous influence. And so as we think about Jonathan and Mephibosheth and David, David says, for thy father's sake. But that in no amount decreases from the influence of the mother. There is an influence that mothers have that like no other, and mothers need to be understanding of that influence and the ability to pass it on from one generation to the next. For thy father's sake. The greatest thing that you and I can leave to our children is a good name. That they will not be ashamed of, but that they would be proud of it. They would be able, as the example I gave, of the young man to say, I am his son. And as a result, be blessed as a result of it. Our prayer should be that God will help us to be the right kind of example to our children. I know these are familiar stories, and perhaps you have some examples or some questions or comments that you would like to add. So we've got a little bit of time. So if you would have a comment or a question that you'd like to make, please do it now. No question. Oh, there's one back. Susan always has a question.
I think that David also showed his kindness when he was, I forget her husband's name, Abigail's husband, when she met him at the fence, or I call it the fence, when he didn't, he came at to provide provisions for David's men. But then Abigail came out and she provided, and then he didn't seek retaliation against her husband for being such a pain in the neck and having such a bad attitude. So he showed kindness to her too at that time.
Absolutely. What is kindness? He said, I want to show the kindness of God to. What is kindness? We're commanded as Christians to be kind one to another. What does that mean? If what? Okay. Forgiveness would be an act of kindness. Mean what? Doing good to others certainly would be kindness, wouldn't it? And both of those actions are commands to Christians. Yes. What?
Acts of love.
Acts of love. Okay.
Accepting other people's faults.
Accepting other people's faults. What do you mean by that, Brett? Accepting their faults.
Well, because some people, their personalities and stuff, and sometimes people judge people over personality before they even know that person. So, accepting somebody, get to know them before you judge them, I guess. Sometimes people have a tendency to judge people before they even know them.
Okay.
And shy away from them.
Okay. So withholding judgment.
Yeah.
Is that truly kindness, though?
Well,
If I see you doing something that I know is sinful, or if I see you doing something that is going to work to your harm, is kindness just saying, well, he'll find out?
I don't mean it quite that way. I guess what I'm saying is if somebody,
Well, me kind of thinking like you after all these years. One time, I judged a group of people based on a few from their religion or whatever, Muslim, after 9/11. And I hated that I felt that way every time I saw someone that was a Muslim. And, how can you convert somebody like that? If you don't want to get anywhere near them.
So that really the act of kindness that Brett's talking about is not judging or making an opinion without all the information. A kind person would say, yeah, I know he did that, but I want to know why he did that. And then if there's some answer to that, being able to do something in a kind and loving way. Not to say I'm going to tolerate. We get that message over and over, that we ought to tolerate all of this looting and killing and violence that's going on. We ought to tolerate people expressing their anger. No, we shouldn't. We need to understand why and then try to alleviate the problem. But again, tolerance is a message that we hear every day. Well, you just ought to tolerate it, just understand it, just so on. And agree with it. Okay.
Give the person the benefit of the doubt, find out what they truly are and what they, if somebody's saying something about them, find out for yourself and don't, show them the kindness of doing that.
Okay, very good. Don't rely on the opinions of others. That you need to do your own research. And again, kindness certainly would eliminate the idea that I would never do that. When people say that, it just sends chills up my spine. And my question is, how do you know that? How do you know that you would never do that? How do you know that if you were in the same situation, that you would not do the same thing over again? That's the judgment that we're condemned of. And certainly you can't know that unless you've been there. Now, we can say to Bill and Beverly, I know how you feel. No, not unless you've been there. Not unless you've lost a dear brother or unless you've lost a mother or father or a sister or someone else dear to you. If you've been there in that situation, then you may come to understand. But to say, I know how you feel, that's a given. That it's not always the case. Jeannie? What is what?
Meanness.
Oh, what is the act of meanness?
No, the opposite, and I said meanness.
Oh, yeah, okay. Kindness certainly is the opposite of meanness.
Opposite of kindness. She said, what is the opposite of kindness?
Anger. Anger. And sin. Here was David saying, I'm going to show the kindness of God. And to resent that, and for, Mephibosheth could have said, hey, David, look, I appreciate your kindness, but I don't want to. I'm doing well where I am, and I'd like to stay where I am. He could have refused that, but he would have suffered as a result of it. Susan, last point.
I think that kindness is under the umbrella of grace, is unmerited. So when we show kindness to someone, it's not that it's something they don't ask for. We give it to them freely. It's not something that they're requesting.
Okay. Well, in the last moment or two that we have, I just want to remind you once again, and that's the whole purpose of this lesson, for thy Father's sake. Men and women, brothers and sisters, what you do now not only affects you in the day of judgment, but it affects your children and your children's children in the day of judgment. We need to hope and pray that our lives are such that we don't cast a shadow over our children or our grandchildren that causes them undue hurt or damage to their reputation and to their lives. I appreciate your input, and I hope we've given you some things to think about, and hopefully a challenge for each of us as we live each day in front of our children and in front of our grandchildren as to how we live. Thank you.